Seems like we know what the first domino to fall this offseason will be for the Detroit Lions, and that will be moving off of veteran linebacker Jalen Reeves-Maybin. So let's get right into it. As always, before we get into today's video, got to give a shout out to our sponsor for today's video and for this NFL season, BetUS. Use code YouTube150 down in the description to get a 150% deposit match on your first deposit, 125% on the next two deposits as your sign-up bonus if you're looking for your sportsbook. Right now, they have NFL specials that are essentially like the trade market in a lot of ways. Like if the player is no longer on the same team they were on, then you can go over here and bet on which team will be the next team they land with. You can see Myles Garrett is on here. The Detroit Lions fall right behind Green Bay at plus 1,200. If you think that's good value, if you think this is going to happen, this might be the time to get in on it. There was a report this morning about Philadelphia, so I got to believe that this just helps the odds for the Lions. NFL Combine. So if you're watching the NFL Combine, you might be able to find some numbers over here as well to bet on. So if you're looking for a sports book, look at this. Jonathan Allen. Lions are favorites to land Jonathan Allen. Want to get in on this? You think, hey, Jalen Reeves-Maben being let go, that opens up more cap space. We need more cap space to take on a trade for year one. Out to BetUS. Now let's get to today's video. So yesterday, Tom Pelissero reported that the Detroit Lions are expected to be moving off of Jalen Reeves-Maben once the new league year begins. It wasn't a huge surprise when I saw this news. It's not something that I said that I would have thought for sure would have happened, but it's not a massive surprise for me. I've said many times that I feel like the Lions are in a really good spot roster-wise where they could almost just play a game tomorrow. They don't have a ton of guys under contract. They currently have 52 guys under contract, but the players they have under contract are a lot of core pieces, starters, a lot of developmental pieces for the future. They're in a really nice spot roster-wise, even though they don't have like 70 players under contract, or they're lower than a lot of other teams there. And when you look at the obvious cuts that you typically have during the offseason, like, oh yeah, that's going to be a cap casualty, open up some cap space, the Lions don't really have a lot of those names. There's not a lot of those clear-cut options. I mean, I read something where someone said Hendon Hooker, and I was like, what? Hendon Hooker? You're not moving off of Hendon Hooker. The point is there's not a lot of obvious cuts, so those kind of like cut candidate videos that you would do in the past are hard to come across. And Jalen Reeves-Maben was one that I got myself to make the move when I did mock offseason 1.0. If you haven't seen that, I also moved off of Jalen Reeves-Maben. Now, I swung it around. That way I could open up a little bit of cap space to then turn around and go add Dre Greenlaw as a backup linebacker, though I don't know how realistic that is. It definitely means that this offseason, it wouldn't surprise me if the Lions again invested in a linebacker, especially for the future, especially as a will linebacker that could potentially replace Alex Anzalone down the road, whether it's through the draft or free agency. He's on the final year of his contract. He was on a 2-year deal, and this is how the Lions typically do it. They'll have the out at the back end of the contract with a much higher cap hit. His cap hit was set for $4.6 million this season, a little bit on the higher side, but with a cut to Jalen Reeves-Maben, he would only save the Lions just under $2 million at $1.895 million with $2.75 million in dead cap. Now, to me, one of the biggest strengths the Lions have had over the years with Brad Holmes and this entire scouting department has been their ability to really limit dead cap, limiting how much dead cap they've actually had on the books, which has opened up so much financial freedom for them. And now we're transitioning into a different stage where it's a lot of extensions and a lot of these guys that we're locking in for long-term deals where if you have to move off of them, there would be some legitimate dead cap. But the hope is those are the core pieces. You trust those players and you move forward. And I think that's why we feel really good about where the roster's at, even though there's only 52 players under contract, because of how many guys are core pieces that are currently under contract and will continue to get those extensions going forward. And that speaks to finding those core pieces specifically through the draft constantly. So this isn't a move to open up a ton of cap space, but it can open up a little bit of cap space. And Jalen Reeves-Maben was a very interesting situation this past season. We'll talk about that here in 1 second, but I do want to hit on kind of the salary cap numbers according to Over the Cap, as now the 2025 cap number has been set for the NFL at $279.2 million. So because of that number with rollover cap, according to Over the Cap, the Lions is going to be set at about $302.9 million, meaning about $51.5 million in cap space. And then effective cap space, which would take into account having a top 51 on your roster, which the Lions do right now, as well as a rookie draft class, the Lions would be at about $48 million in effective cap space, which is to me more important than the other numbers. And that means specifically, because you have to be able to fill out your roster, $48 million will put the Lions at 10th most in the NFL. The Lions are in a really good spot financially this offseason. It's just about going forward. The Lions need to have flexibility because they have a lot of extensions kicking in, and they're going to continue to kick in. And we see that next year when we look at the salary cap numbers and where it's much lower because of how many players that are really diving into their big deals now. And now the Lions are going to have flexibility next year. They can restructure deals. They can find ways to open up space. And there will be a couple maybe more obvious cuts next year. Potentially a guy like Graham Glasgow. I don't think that'll happen this offseason, but potentially going forward, there could be a few of those. But I think a lot of restructures could be in play. And then we'll just have to see where that ultimately that number is going to fall. But I would also say for the Lions, keep an eye on this offseason. The benefit that they have is, number one, short-term deals again, because financially they're in a good spot right now as unknowns. it's going to be very hard to find many deals the Lions I expect to make that are multi-year deals to unknown players unless they are very team-friendly, where they're really locking guys in free agency. I don't expect to see many of those moves whatsoever, maybe a couple at most. I don't think we're going to see many of those moves.
Now, I will say, for those hoping for some sort of trade to happen, if you look at a guy like Jonathan Allen, for example, in his contract and what his cap number would be for the new team, it's about $22 million on the last year of his current deal. That's a player with a high base salary that, if was moved for at least year one, opening up more cap space would be necessary, understanding that he doesn't have any deals for the future, so that there's flexibility there whether to re-sign him or not re-sign him. But if you were going to bring him in, it's about how much it's going to cost immediately for a lot of guys because they're toward the back end of their deal when we talk about trade candidates. It's the extension, of course, that makes this all difficult. But if you really were trying to pull off a trade, opening up more cap space year one is necessary for a lot of these guys.
And that's because Brad Holmes is going to prioritize bringing the players that he says are known goods on their roster. So with this cap flexibility, the Lions have flexibility to bring in potential short-term deals where you're not locked in and potentially stuck in a stuffed spot if that player doesn't pan out because they're unknowns, as Brad Holmes put it. The Lions have the cap space to bring in short-term deals, which they typically do anyways, but they're in a good spot to do that this offseason and not affect future years outside of throwing void years on contracts. And really, with the Lions' dead cap right now, which is just at about $18 million for this year, that may seem high. It's pretty much just void years and Cam Sutton. The Cam Sutton situation is $6.5 million for the Lions dead cap. Carlton Davis had the void years, so that's all accelerated to $9.8 million. That's just where it is. You give him a new extension. The Lions, he'll be back on the roster anyway, so it won't even be really considered dead cap. And then you also have Marcus Davenport, who has a void year that the Lions gave him for just like over $2 million. So ultimately, the Lions really don't have a ton of players that they had to just cut and move off of outside of UDFAs that they gave guarantees to, and that's where the dead cap falls into play there. So the Lions are in a good spot financially, and I would also say keep an eye on the Lions with the rollover cap. Now, there are limits to this. It's not like you can roll over all the money you have and just make no moves, and next year have a ton of cap space. Plus, there's not a huge benefit in just doing that over and over because the cap number is going up every year. Mathematically, it doesn't make sense. Instead, putting void years does make sense if it's going to rise consistently, that those void years can kind of balance itself out. That's why the Lions do it. Rollover cap situation, you have to spend 89% within a 4-year span, and the Lions have somewhere over like $20 million, I believe they rolled over from this past season, somewhere in that range. Look for them to, again, reasonably, because they have to hit that number. They have to spend 89% of their cap space. They can't just not spend the money and like, we're just going to roll it all over. They have to spend that number over a 4-year span. Look for the Lions again to try to take advantage of some rollover cap in the next year, especially considering the amount of cap numbers that are going to be rising next season for the Lions. Now, when it comes to Jalen Reeves-Maben, I'm not like excited that this is going to happen, or it seems like it's going to happen, is moving off Jalen. I'm still a Jalen Reeves-Maben fan, and even going back today and watching some of this film from this past season, I'm still a fan of the guy, and I wouldn't have hated if the Lions were like, yeah, we're just going to find a way to keep him around. But like I said, I'm not shocked. It's enough cap space where you can kind of flip it into potentially another move this offseason to try to find that future piece. And Jalen, who's now 30 years old, had a weird season last year, right? We saw him at the beginning of the season, and he was kind of just your sub package, obvious passing down situation. He played a few snaps a game. He was out there with Alex Anzalone as a little bit of an underneath zone coverage piece, sometimes some man coverage. We saw that against the Rams. We saw that against the Bucks. And then he got his real first jump against Arizona. And I would say when he was playing and playing consistently early in the season, I didn't think he played that poorly for the Lions. Arizona, Seattle, Dallas, and a little bit against Tennessee and Minnesota. But in those kind of spot roles, about 10 to 20 snaps within those games, I thought he played fine. It was kind of what you would expect from Jalen. Like the first time, we really saw him take over on his defense was in the red zone. We saw his coverage abilities. Like, this guy needs to keep seeing the field. And Jalen Reeves-Maben, I thought, looked like the Jalen Reeves-Maben of old through those games that I had went through. However, he had an injury against the Green Bay Packers in Week 9, which knocked him out till Week 17, where he then returned against San Fran. If we remember, by that time, the Lions linebacker room was just completely decimated. He steps back in, plays 40 snaps, and it felt like one of the worst games that he played this past season was in that game. He had 3 missed tackles. I remember after the game, like, what went wrong? Hey, guys like Jalen Reeves-Maben missing 3 tackles. That was like out of character for him to have something like that happen. And he had the shoulder injury. Then it was listed as a neck injury, which I had completely forgotten about. And I think that could play a role in this for sure. That at the end of the season went from 40 snaps against San Fran to rarely seeing the field. He played 6 snaps in the playoffs and a rough game against San Francisco when he came back to a depleted linebacker room. Now, what I still like about Jalen is all the things that you would typically like about Jalen. He's still very adequate in terms of coverage. I actually think he's a plus coverage player. Against tight ends that I don't have the best shake, maybe Maybe they're a little bit more of kind of your linear route runners. Those are the kind of pieces that Jalen Reeves-Maben has success against. We saw it against Arizona specifically. We saw it against Dallas. He's successful in those spots. He can play inline tight ends pretty well in man coverage, and he brings that element, which is like, hey, beyond Alex Anzalone, who is your coverage piece at linebacker, he was probably the one that I would have trusted the most, specifically in man coverage assignments, having to deal with a running back, say, out of the backfield. He's an attacker. He's physical. We remember when we first had him, the amount of strip sacks to clutch performances. This guy is physical as heck. He tries to fight his way into the play late. He attacks blocks at the point of attack, and we did see, even against Arizona, he had a bad 15-yard penalty, but he is a downhill aggressive, put him in space. You don't want him to deal with blocks consistently, where he can just fly downhill, attack pullers, and be pretty quick to fill gaps, be pretty quick to have an opportunistic ability to create tackles for loss because of the aggression that he does play with. And it's really a good opposite of a guy like Jack Campbell and his skill set to have a guy that can play with a little bit more field. To me, he still wasn't super twitchy this past year, especially later in the season at the top of the route. We saw some struggles there when put in man coverage spots against San Francisco, even in zone coverage a little bit as well. It was kind of what you would expect from a linebacker, but it didn't go above and beyond in terms of the coverage skill set that we did see. When he was placed on the line of scrimmage, it was not very consistent at all. There was a feistiness to his game, but in terms of being able to create lockout or consistent shed at the point of attack, that was all over the place with his hand usage, being able to get off blocks and just be reliable when having to deal with blockers at the second level. That was inconsistent, just the shed ability as a whole. I don't know that that's a role the Lions would have loved him in, is that the flexibility to actually put him on the line of scrimmage. He was never a great blitzer for the Lions. If anything, he was probably average at best as a blitzer, so he didn't stand out in that category either. He had a very specific role, right? He was a good special teamer for the Lions, very good special teamer, that I think that was a lot of the reason the Lions signed him back. And then when they also signed him back, if you go back to the video when we did re-sign him, was, hey, defensively, there's a role for him. He can help us in coverage. He's a smart player. And I don't think that's changed. He still feels like he has pretty good instincts. He still feels like he has a pretty nice awareness. Some will go over aggression at times, but a lot of the things I think I still liked about Jalen, I still liked when watching it back this year, which is why I wouldn't have had a problem if the Lions said, we're just going to keep him around. But if the Lions do move off him, I would understand it, because there's not a ton of easy ways to create cap space this offseason in terms of just cuts. There's not a lot of this. Could be the only one that legitimately is like, oh, that's obvious. That's actually going to open up some cap space, even though it's not a lot. That's the only one that kind of feels like it falls into that category. So I expect with Malcolm Rodriguez, who continues to take a step forward. I mean, he had a streak of playing 40 snaps in 3 games without Jalen Reeves-Maben when he was off week 11, week 12, and week 13. He played 43, 49, 46 snaps. When you have a guy with that kind of flexibility that was capable of playing on the line of scrimmage, you have a guy like Trevor Nowatzki that's an exclusive rights free agent, will probably place the tender there. He'll probably be brought back for another offseason competition. I do understand the move. 159 snaps this past season, and he was fine this past year. So with that, Jalen Reeves-Maben, it sounds like they're going to be moving off. We'll see if that officially happens, but I understand it. Not rooting for it necessarily. Wishing Jalen Reeves-Maben the best if this is the case and this does happen, man. I was hyped when we got him back. I still like the player, so if somehow he cross paths with us again and we land him again, I would have no issue with it. But financially speaking, I think just over a $4.5 million cap hit feels a little bit on the higher side. If the Lions could open up a little more cap space for this season specifically, where they don't have to worry about things in the future here, dead cap and things along those lines in the future, it can open up some flexibility, potentially try to go a different direction. I think the Lions do need to get better at backup linebacker. I think it's worthy of going after. And I think this was the one piece that you could legitimately move on at linebacker. You couldn't move off of Malcolm. You weren't going to. Malcolm's playing well. It wouldn't make any sense. Zeke Turner, David Long, these were 1-year deals for the Lions. This was like the one guy that legitimately could have opened up cap space at linebacker that you could actually cut this offseason, that also could allow you to potentially help bring back Derek Barnes, or potentially go a different route to try to get younger and maybe a little bit better at backup linebacker as well. So we'll see what happens, but I'm going to leave it there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Shout out to BetUS for sponsoring today's video.